Tele2 is the newest mobile network operator in the Netherlands and is the smallest by customer number. Interestingly, yesterday, T-Mobile Netherlands offered to acquire Tele2, and so potentially they will no longer be the fourth network in the Netherlands should T-Mobile acquire them and sort of merge with them. So that kind of precipitated the making of this video a little bit. However, for the sake of right now, Tele2 is, like I say, the sort of fourth mobile network operator of the Netherlands, and they operate a 4G only network. So they have 4G on 800 MHz and 4G on 2600 MHz, 10 MHz on 800 and 20 MHz on 2600, both FDD, so both of those spectrum allocations are paired. The 800 MHz uses EAR-FCN of 6200 and the 2600 MHz is 3300. Like I said, they have no 2G or 3G spectrum, however they do have a 2G and 3G domestic roaming agreement with T-Mobile, so those without VoLTE devices, or if you leave the coverage footprint of Tele2, can use T-Mobile. Although of course, if T-Mobile purchases them, then obviously that will not remain. Vendor-wise, they use Nokia Siemens networks for their base station equipment, and antennas do vary, but on Tele2 individual sites, they are typically Catherine antennas, and obviously if they're sharing with T-Mobile, then the antennas will sort of depend on what T-Mobile has a little bit, but still quite a lot of Catherine there. It's very rare for Tele2 to be broadcasting on a site without T-Mobile also being present, and that comes in either two forms which I'll cover in the video, where either Tele2 uses separate antennas and T-Mobile is present somewhere else on the mast, or they actually share the antennas themselves but obviously have separate broadcasting equipment because T-Mobile uses Huawei for their radio access network equipment. The first site example that I will talk about is a site where the antennas are not shared. So it's structure share, or in rare cases just Tele2 or Tele2 another operator that is not T-Mobile. And in this example, you can see there are dual band Catherine antennas with low ports and high ports. The low ports will be carrying the 800 MHz and the high ports will be carrying the 2600 MHz. And based on appearance and some knowledge of Nokia remote radios, I would suggest that the 800 MHz remote radios are FRMBs and the 2600 MHz ones are FRHBs. So next I will move on to what is, or what was by far the most common arrangement that I observed in my time in the Netherlands, and this uses two antennas per sector. One is a dual low band Catherine antenna, so that then carries the 900 MHz 3G and 4G for T-Mobile and the 800 MHz 4G for Tele2. Meanwhile, there is also a triple high band antenna which then carries the 3G 4G 2100 for T-Mobile, the 2G 4G 1800 for T-Mobile and the 2600 MHz for Tele2. And once again on this example, it's possible to see the Nokia Siemens Networks remote radio units as we saw in a previous example, but as we only see one sector on this image, there are only two RRUs, one for the 800 MHz and one for the 2600 MHz, but across the overall site there will be 6 remote radios. And the third and final example is using a much more multi-band antenna than we saw previously. So this uses a Huawei quad band antenna which has low ports as well as a set of high ports. The high bands are arranged much as they were in the previous example, so there's the 1800 MHz for T-Mobile, 2100 MHz for T-Mobile and the 2600 MHz for Tele2, all going through separate ports in the antenna. However, the 900 MHz for T-Mobile and the 800 MHz for Tele2 is diplexed into the low band ports on the antenna because it's only got single low band, i.e. 2 low band ports, which means that diplexing is required on those low frequencies, whereas the 3 sets of high frequencies can all be fed separately because the antenna's got 3 sets of high band or 6 high band ports. So I've covered 3 setups in this video. I don't claim that that's every possible configuration that Tele2 has in the Netherlands, because obviously I didn't see every site they had there, although I think based certainly on the relatively limited number of configurations the other providers have, and for that matter just the simple fact they only actually had 2 frequency bands themselves, means I can't see there being too many other configurations or that anything too different from a sort of schematic level. Due to the in-depth sharing, physical sharing in terms of masts and in particular antennas, I can see a consolidation slash merger working actually very smoothly from a network level, because on sites where Tele2 and T-Mobile share an antenna, potentially the consolidation will then just involve replacing the Nokia Siemens equipment with Huawei equipment to then mean that there's a consistent Huawei radio access network for all the frequencies, and then rerouting some feeders really. So it's not sort of a major physical antenna swap or anything that would be required. So I mean that potentially would work very well, and it would give T-Mobile then 20 megahertz paired of low band spectrum for 4G in the form of 900 megahertz and 800 megahertz. Of course, potentially they could do even more than that, dependent on if they refarm more of the 900 megahertz, as well as a additional 20 megahertz paired in the high band range to complement their existing 30 megahertz, split between 10 megahertz on 2100 and 20 on 1800. Although once again, T-Mobile could deploy even more than that just themselves if they refarm more, but the T-Mobile configuration is covered in more detail on the T-Mobile video, as you would expect. So all in all, interesting times ahead for Tele2, whether they stay as a separate network or whether they get consolidated with T-Mobile. So thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next video, which could be a whole variety of things, because I've not made a video in quite a while before this due to other work that I've had to do. So there's a big queue of everything from Vodafone Netherlands to Isle of Man network stuff, to then the end of year reviews for the UK, and a whole lot more videos that I could potentially make. So I will see you then.